So, I don't remember the first time it happened, but I do remember it happening many times throughout my life. My friends and I would be sitting around somewhere, and somebody would ask the question, if you only had one day to live, what would you do? And every time the question came up, we would start just prattling off all the things that we ever wanted to do, kind of like the bucket list thing. But we were young and we were stupid a little bit, so we also threw in all the crazy stuff as well. I know when I used to do it, I was pretty young and I was a little wild, and I used to think of the absolute craziest things I could think of, like skydiving with nothing but a surfboard taped to my feet or something stupid, because I had seen some kind of a stuntman do something similar or whatever. But my life is very different now. And not only do I live very differently, I have very different things to live for in my life nowadays. And so today, if I were asked that question, I'd probably say that I'd gather up my family and I would go see my son in Ottawa. If I only had a day to live, I'd want to have my family around me. Perhaps I'd also have my brothers and my parents and my nieces and nephews and my in-laws as well, because, hey, the more the merrier. I love my family. I love being around my family. I love the time that we have together. And so we would all gather around and we would spend my last day kind of enjoying family. We'd be maybe eating together or playing together, laughing together, talking together. But whatever we would do, I would want to do it with them. I know what matters most to me, and if I only had one day left to live, you better believe that would be what I would do. Have you ever thought about it? Has that question ever come up in any of the circles you have run with? You ever seriously considered what you would do with your time if you only had one day to live? You ever thought about who you'd want to be with, and maybe what you'd like to pass on to them before you went? I think everybody should consider that at least once in their life. In fact, for me, every once in a while I like to think about, if I only had one day left, what would I do? Today in our CrossWalk series, we're going to be talking about what Jesus did when he only had one day left to live. Now, a lot happened on that day, but we're going to talk about something in particular that happened on that day, because unlike you and I, who have no idea when we are going to leave this world, Jesus knew what was about to happen to him. He knew that his time had come. He knew that very soon he was going to be killed. And just like any of us, you can be sure that Jesus had spent some time thinking about what he would do with his last day in these last moments. And so this morning, I'd like to read to you something very specific. We did watch a cartoon earlier, so you should all be at least vaguely familiar with this passage. This comes from John chapter 13, and beginning in verse 1, it says this. Before the Passover celebration, Jesus knew that his hour had come to leave this world and return to his Father. He had loved his disciples during his earthly ministry, and now he loved them to the very end. It was time for supper, and the devil had already prompted Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had given him all authority over everything, and that he had come from God and would return to God. So he got up from the table, took off his robe, wrapped a towel around his waist, and poured water into a basin. Then he began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel he had around him. When Jesus came to Simon Peter, Peter said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You don't understand what I am doing, but someday you will." "No," Peter protested, "you will never wash my feet." Jesus replied, "Unless I wash you, you won't belong to me." Simon Peter exclaimed, "Woohoo!" Come on, stay with me now. Peter exclaimed, "Then wash my hands and head as well, not just my feet." Jesus replied, "A person who has bathed all over does not need to wash except for the feet to be entirely clean. And you disciples are clean, but not all of you." For Jesus knew who would betray him. That is what he meant when he said, "Not all of you are clean." After washing their feet, he put on his robe again and he sat down and asked, "Do you understand what I was doing? You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, because that is what I am. And since I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash each other's feet. I have given you an example to follow. Do as I have done to you. I tell you the truth, slaves are not greater than their master, nor is the messenger more important than the one who sends the message. Now that you know these things, God will bless you for doing them." Now, to be fair, I've preached on this passage, a bunch of times, and every time I go back to it, I start seeing different things than I saw last time. It's one of the incredible things about the living Word is that God continues to speak to us through it. And there's been a lot of really great stuff in there. There's a lot of stuff about serving, in fact, and often when I've preached on serving, this is my go-to passage to kind of punctuate the point. But today we're going to talk about something a little bit different. Today I want to talk about how this incredible act of Jesus dispels some of the biggest lies in this world about love that many people believe these days. The first lie that he dispels that we're going to look at today is this: that I must be worthy of love to be loved. You ever heard that before? I must be worthy of love in order to be loved. And as terrible as it may be, this lie is actually believed by so many people these days. It's a lie that preys on the emotions of people. It even calls into question their identity. It's a lie that creates such incredible despair in so many today, especially young people. It's a lie that usually sounds something like this: in order for someone to love me, I must be beautiful, or intelligent, or gifted, or powerful, or popular, or I have to perform to certain expectations, or I have to achieve certain things in order to be loved. That's simply not true at all. But it's no wonder a lot of people have swallowed this lie because of the way our culture treats imperfection. They treat beautiful people like they're worth love, and those of us that are just average, we're treated as though we're unworthy. Our culture deceives people into thinking that they have to be a perfect 10 in some area in order to be worthy of love, and it's not true. When we look in the mirror, a reflection doesn't show our whole true worth, not at all. And it certainly doesn't show our worthiness for being loved. Our security shouldn't come from our looks. Our significance shouldn't come from our achievements. Our worth is not decided by popularity, because our worth is tied to our identity, and our identity is found in Him. He declares our worth of being loved. No one demonstrated the truth about love more than or better than Jesus. Look at our first two passages from this morning. Before the Passover celebration, Jesus knew that his hour had come to leave this world and return to the Father. He had loved his disciples during his ministry on earth, and now he loved them to the very end. It was time for supper, and the devil had already prompted Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Judas was one of those guys that was probably hard to love. You know what I'm saying? He was probably challenging to love. And yet, Jesus loved him. Verse 11 in John 13 reminds us that Jesus knew that Judas was the one that was going to betray him. He knew it already. And despite this, Jesus loved Judas. And we need to see that. Jesus loved Judas, the one that was going to give him up to the Romans, the one that was going to set into motion the very chain of events that would lead to his death. And yet Jesus loved him. See, even Judas was loved. And if Judas was loved, then you and I are certainly able to love and to be loved. In fact, as I've been very fond of reminding people, there is nothing you can ever do to make God love you any less. Before suffering and dying for us, Jesus was going to show his disciple the full extent of his love, is what the scripture says. So he put himself in the place of a servant and washed their feet. And that included Judas. He washed Judas's feet. Jesus knew everything about Judas, and yet he still washed his feet. He knew all about the stealing. He knew all about the attitude. He knew all about the selfishness. He knew that Judas would soon betray him to death, and yet he still loved him. He still washed his feet. He still got down on his knees and took the man's dirty, gross, calloused feet in his hands and washed them clean. Is there someone that you know that you've been having a difficult time loving? Is there anybody in your life that maybe is causing you grief somehow, making it difficult for you to act loving towards them? Is there someone in your life right now, perhaps even, that Jesus could help you to love more? Will you choose to follow Jesus' example and recognize that everyone can be and should be loved? Jesus knew everything about Judas, everything there was to know, even the deep, dark, hidden secrets that Judas never told anybody. Jesus knew it all and still loved him. Jesus knows everything about you, every moment of your life, every dirty little secret that you never told anybody, and he still loves you. Jesus knows everything there is to know about us, and yet he loves us. His love for you is unconditional, even if the world's idea of love is more like, I love you unconditionally with one condition. Again, the lie of the world tells us that I must be worthy of love to be loved, but the truth that Jesus taught us, that we're reminded of this very morning, is that you are loved not because you deserve it, but because God is love. It's who he is. It's not about what you're capable of, or what you've accomplished, or how you look, or even your behavior. That's not what determines the love that is poured out upon you. What determines the love poured out upon you is the heart of the living God. And he loves you right where you are, just as you are right now, wherever you may be, whatever life was like for you first thing this morning when you rolled out of bed. God loves you right where you are. He just doesn't want to leave you there. Amen? God is love. He declared everyone everywhere worthy of love. You don't have to live up to anyone's expectations, including your own, for God to love you. You don't have to meet a certain standard for God to love you. You don't have to act a certain way or do a certain thing or be a certain kind of person for God to love you. He loves you. Period. Or exclamation mark, as I have it written. You are of great value and worth to him. And you didn't have to be anything or do anything for this to happen other than his creation. He loves you. The being and doing come after his love. They are born out of his love. Jesus lived to show love to everyone, even the ones that others were trying to stay away from. You know what I mean? I mean, the scriptures talk about the lepers and the prostitutes and tax collectors, the demon-possessed, the sick, the poor, the liars, the cheaters, and everyone else in between. Jesus loved them. He wanted it to be clear that no one anywhere was outside of the scope of his love. So live his example. Offer someone love, forgiveness, compassion this week. John said, "Dear friends, since God loved us, we must love each other. He also said, if we say we love God but hate others, we are liars, for we cannot love God whom we have not seen if we do not love others whom we have seen. Love is the foundation of God's nature and his character. It's who he is, and it's one of the core truths about both him and his followers, his children. Jesus said, if you have love for one another, then everyone will know you are my disciples. Then they'll know that you're my disciples. Jesus said his followers would be known by their love, not their rules, not their church name, or anything else, but by their love. So you should be living a life that shows love and living with the confidence that the Lord loves you. There's nothing that you have to do to earn his love. It's given by him. It is who he is. So don't go around believing that you must do something or change something or look a certain way in order to be loved. God created you and he loves you. He's declared that truth. He loves you right where you are. And that's where the transformation begins, not where it ends. Now, the second lie that Jesus dispels is that I must feel love to show love. Ever been there? I got to feel love to. I don't feel like that toward. I don't feel that. I hear it all the time. And this is a lie that goes something like, love is just something you feel and you can't help it. It kind of just happens inside, and I can't love someone if I don't feel loving towards them. I mean, I have to feel it, right? Well, the truth is that love does affect our emotions. Absolutely it does. But it is so much more than that. Whether it's showing love to a friend or a spouse or a child or a co-worker, if love were just an emotion, you wouldn't love for very long because emotions change, right? I mean, emotions change all the time. Sometimes they change with weather. Right? Who gets a little dreary themselves when the skies are gray and the rain starts to drizzle down? I do. Right? I look outside and there's no sunshine. I'm like, oh, I already feel icky. Right? Sometimes it changes with weather. Sometimes it changes with circumstances. You go through a difficult time. Sometimes you don't feel loving. Sometimes our feelings change as we change. We're always changing in life. We're growing through different seasons in our life. We're growing up. We're moving on. And sometimes our feelings change. Sometimes they change with a cup of coffee. Am I right? Just saying. So it cannot be true that I must feel love in order to show love. Look at the next verses in our passage this morning. Jesus knew that the Father had given him authority over everything and that he had come from God and would return to God. So he got up from the table, took off his robe, wrapped a towel around his waist, and poured water into a basin, and then began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel he had around them. You know, in light of the fact that Jesus had been given all authority over everything, you would have thought that the disciples would be just kind of lining up to wash his feet, right? I mean, doesn't that make sense to me? When I read that, I'm like, yeah, why weren't the disciples like fighting each other to get at his feet? I know, okay, that's weird. I just made it weird. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do that. But instead, we actually learn, if you go to the parallel passage in Luke and you read what was going on, you find out that they were actually arguing over which of the disciples was the most awesome. They were arguing about which one of them would be the greatest in the kingdom of God. I have this for you. This is in Luke chapter 22, beginning in verse 24. He says this, and they began, talking about the disciples, and they began to argue amongst themselves as to who would be the greatest in the coming kingdom. Jesus told them, in this world, kings and great men order the people around, and yet they're called friends of people. But among you, those who are the greatest should take the lowest rank, and their leader should be like a servant. Normally, the master sits at the table and is served by the servants, but not here, for I am your servant. I mean, they're fighting for a throne and a title. And Jesus suggested instead that they pick up a towel. Why? Because love is not something you express when you feel like it. Sure, it has an emotional element, but if that's all there is to love, then we're in real trouble. Love is more than hearts and flowers. It's dishes and dirty laundry sometimes. It's more than sappy movies and mushy poems. Sometimes it's about paying bills and taking out the trash. It is the soft, tender moments, but it is also the hard decisions made together. And not just in marriage, I'm talking. We have a lot to do together. And love is being together through the thick and the thin. Right? Well, I don't know, am I right? This is what I'm seeing as I'm reading about this demonstration of love that Jesus gave us for a reason. Because I confess to you, I have been a follower of Jesus Christ for a long time, and I am still learning how to do this. I don't imagine it felt particularly good for Jesus to get down and wash the dirty, calloused feet of his disciples. I mean, that's gross. It certainly wouldn't have felt good to suffer and die for the sins of the world shortly after his meal, but love is not just about feelings. You don't have to feel love to demonstrate it to others. We're kind of like a little girl I heard of named Nan, who was in Children's Letters to God, when she said, "Dear God, I bet it's very hard for you to love all of everybody in the whole world. There are only 4 people in our family, and I have trouble loving them." And while that statement is actually kind of cute when you think about it, it's also a little accurate. Love is sometimes hard. It's sometimes challenging, difficult for us to do. Love is even sometimes work. So no wonder it's difficult to love when you don't feel like loving, but that's exactly the essence of true love, real love. Well, love is a choice, not just an emotion. Love is something we decide to do. Jesus washed his disciples' feet and then shortly thereafter died on a cross because he was committed to love. Not just the idea of it, but to do it, no matter what he was feeling. And if we're going to love, we're going to have to choose love, not just wait until we feel like doing it. Our problem is that we get to know one another so well that we discover each other's weaknesses and oddities, and then we don't feel so much like showing it all the time. And I mean, it can happen in our friendships, it definitely happens with siblings, it can even happen in a marriage or right here in our own church family. I mean, you heard that whole old saying, the honeymoon's over? Yeah? Okay, well, they're not talking about the trip from Niagara Falls being done with. Right? They're talking about that season or that moment when the husband or wife finally gets to know how weird their spouse is. So what do you do when you discover that your friend or your sibling or your spouse or another member of your church family is from another planet? Oh, Jamie. You get intentional about loving people in your life. And hear this, please hear this, you let the love you live determine what you feel, not the other way around. You let the love that you live determine what you feel, not the other way around. But this lie about feeling love in order to show love is so strong, some people may still doubt that it's a myth, maybe even you. Matthew 5:43-48 says this, "You have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons and daughters of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love only those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your brothers, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." That kind of love, the loving our enemies kind of love, isn't something you're going to feel like doing. Does that make sense? It's never something I feel like doing. We don't feel like loving our enemies. We're angry about them. We're put off by them. We're uncomfortable around them. We don't feel like loving. We need to choose loving. We need to decide loving, be intentional about loving. I mean, when somebody hurts us, when someone rejects us, what do? Well, Jesus told us we're supposed to choose to love. He didn't say anything about feeling like it. It's a lie that you can only love when you feel like loving. Love really is a choice. All right. Now, the third lie that Jesus dispels is that I must not risk loving or I will get hurt. I must not risk loving or I will get hurt. Now, the trouble with this lie, it's a tricky one because it's half true. Do you know that some of the best lies out there are the ones that contain just a little bit of truth? Because we grab onto that and buy into the whole thing. I must not risk loving or I will get hurt. You know, when it comes to relationships, I have learned over the years that there are some women out there that hate men because of a few men that hurt them, and there are some men out there who hate women because of a few women that hurt them. And there are teenagers out there that don't trust adults because of a few adults that let them down, and some people that leave their church families or the church entirely because someone did something that hurt them. So a lot of people end up doing what they shouldn't do. They build barriers and they put up fences and they build brick walls to protect themselves. They hold people at an arm's length. They just don't want to risk being hurt again. They believe the enemy's lie that I must not risk loving or I'm going to get hurt. The truth is, when you don't risk loving or being loved, you're causing yourself more harm than when you do risk it. Those who don't risk don't enjoy the benefits of close, loving relationships because that attitude creeps into every act or relationship of love. And that's how they hurt themselves. They deprive themselves of something every person needs, and it is that perfect love of God. They begin to push back everything. When Jesus came to Simon Peter, Peter said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You don't understand what I am doing, but someday you will." "No," Peter protested. "You'll never wash my feet." Jesus replied, "Unless I wash you, you don't belong to me." Simon Peter exclaimed, Then wash my hands and my head as well, Lord, not just my feet." Jesus replied, "A person who is bathed all over does not need to wash, except for the feet, to be entirely clean." You see, in those days, when you were going to go over to somebody's house or go to some kind of a celebration like a Passover, a bunch of people in a room, you had a kind of a shower. I don't think people bathed as often as we tend to do nowadays. I think people were stinky. That's just my thing. I think that. People were stinky in the days of Jesus, right? We could write a book called Stinky Jesus Days, right? So people would bathe. They would have like some kind of a bath or maybe just a sponge bath, whatever. They would wash themselves head to toe before they went out so that they were clean and, smelled pretty good when they arrived at the party. But the problem is they didn't have paved roads and sidewalks and all that stuff back then. They walked in the dirt. And so by the time they arrived at the home, especially if they were in a rush like we often are, we leave the house with our hair still wet and all that stuff, and then they got mud and gunk caked onto their feet, right? All they had were open-toed sandals. And I don't think they had socks back then, so they can't be cool like me. So, and they would show up at the house, and they're clean, but their feet are gross. So that's what they would get cleaned. And it was the job of the lowest servant, because this is gross, it's disgusting. They would step in stuff, you know what I'm saying? Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. And it was the job of the lowest servant in the house to wash the feet of the people. Any guests that would come in, lowest servant, that's their job. Right? Sasaki job, low man on the totem pole, you do it. Right? If there were no servants in the home, then it was the person with the absolute lowest position of the group that would assume the role of the servant with the lowest position. This is a friendly reminder to please turn your ringtone off. None of the disciples thought to rise from the table and wash anyone's feet, because that would have been like this public announcement that they considered themselves the least of everybody, that they were worth less than everyone else. That would have made them vulnerable, and that might have caused others to think that they could take advantage of them. Not one of them wanted to accept the risk. They didn't want to be known as the least. They wanted to be known as the greatest. They had an argument about it. Their failure to take the place of a servant revealed their insecurities. As was often the case, Peter only spoke what many, if not all of them, were thinking. They were thinking about themselves while they should have been thinking about the needs of others. When I protect myself from being hurt, I'm being selfish. By the very definition of the word. When I do that, the only thing I'm concerned with is me. I mean, you don't like the way that sounds, but that's the truth of it. When I'm protecting myself, it's me I'm thinking about, no matter what it is. What we're learning here about love is that I shouldn't be concerned with protecting me so much as I should be concerned with serving and loving others. Jesus took a custom of the day and he taught us one of the greatest lessons we'll ever learn in life. His entire life, death, and intercession for us are now a testament to this lesson. The Bible tells us very clearly what Jesus was all about. In Mark 10:45, it says, "The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve." If Peter didn't engage in serving others, he wasn't engaging in the ministry of Jesus, which is why Jesus said to him, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." If we are not engaged in serving others, then we are not engaged in the ministry of Jesus. See, unlike his disciples, and us for that matter, Jesus wasn't insecure. He knew his Father had given him all authority. He knew that he was loved, and he knew that he loved his disciples. In fact, he loved everyone in the world. So he took off his outer robe, and he did the job no one else was willing to do. It was too low. It was love that allowed Jesus to serve, and it will be love that will allow you and me to serve. We need to establish the fact that we are loved so that we can risk showing love and being loved. After washing their feet, he put on his robe again and he sat down and he asked, "Do you understand what I was doing? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, because that is what I am. And since I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash each other's feet. I have given you an example to follow. Do as I have done to you." You know, the truth is, if you risk loving someone, it's possible you'll get hurt. That's the truth that's in that. If you love someone, it is possible. It's always possible. Right? Because it involves people, and people are messy. That's this world. That's life. People are messy. We have to have more grace. We have to have His grace within us to navigate that kind of stuff. We can't push back and hold the world back because there's a chance something bad will happen. We need to embrace the way He showed us to live, so that all the good connected with that can pour into our lives. If you risk loving someone, anyone, you really might get hurt. But if you don't risk, of loving or being loved, then you're definitely going to be hurt by depriving yourself of the rich returns that love brings. So this week, I invite you to do 3 things, okay? You don't have to write them down. I think you'll be able to remember them. 3 things. I invite you to know that you are loved. I invite you to make a decision to act in love. At some point this week, you make a decision and act in love. Do it on purpose. And the third one, take a risk for love. Step outside of your comfort zone just a little bit. Take a risk for love and watch what the Lord does with that. Because 1 John 4:19 tells us that we love because he first loved us. And as you love this week, I want to pray the words of the Apostle Paul over you from Ephesians 3:18 and 19, which say this: May you have power, together with all the Lord's holy people, to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses all knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. Let it be so, Lord, I pray.